Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Build America, the national construction podcast that's capturing and sharing the very heartbeat of the industry. And I'm your host, Kerry Smith, owner of Construction News and Review, or CNR. And if you're as curious as I am about how the power of virtual design and construction, VDC, is being brought to bear in practical ways in adaptive reuse projects, listen closely because we have two experts today on this very subject from Russell, a nationwide company specializing in construction and development. And with me on this episode of Build America, I'm happy to introduce our Byron Conley, project engineer with Russell, and Taylor Moon, senior VDC manager with Russell. And gentlemen, welcome to this episode of Build America. We're really glad you're here today.
Thank you for having us, Kerry.
Yes, thank you very much.
Let's dive right in. And if you could explain to our listeners, and for my review, since we're going to be talking about a term called adaptive reuse, I know many of us have heard that, but if you could clarify, what is that, especially within the context of construction?
Adaptive reuse is going to be where you're taking an existing historical building, and it doesn't always have to be historical even then, but you're going to identify a new purpose for the building, similar to, say, a historical preservation. Historical preservation, you're going to go in and reuse the building that's there and create a really exciting new defined application for the same use in our historical preservation. While as adaptive reuse, we're bringing in a new style of purpose for the building. Specifically, I think today we're going to talk about the 21 building downtown St. Louis, where they took a old YMCA and turned it into a hotel and cultural arts museum.
That's awesome. We'll look forward to hearing how you did that and how that relates to VDC or virtual design and construction. I understand this never happens in construction, right, guys? That sometimes adaptive reuse projects involve unforeseen challenges. I can't believe that happens. Due to the history of the building, you're working on these, like you mentioned, 100-plus-year-old structure. How can you, I'm sure it's all about mitigation on the front end of things with your team, but how can VDC take some of the mystery out of what in the old days people might find when they were already into the project itself?
Yeah, so VDC in an application on adaptive reuse is becoming a critical component. The goal is to identify and mitigate, like you said, all of those unforeseen conditions. And with Russell for VDC, we're identifying all of those things by going in and creating a laser scan, a photogrammetry of the exterior of the building, utilizing drones, utilizing different scan applications. But through those processes, we're able to create a very applicable virtual application of that design. So we're able to hand that off to the design team, hand that off to our owner, our clients, our subcontractors to give an identification of what is existing.
Yeah, I think a big thing about it is about increasing the owners, designers, and construction teams' knowledge about what is existing. You need as much information as you can get your hands on about that existing building if you're going to approach it, not for any type of renovation, but especially adaptive reuse.
Sure, no, that makes sense, Taylor and Byron. With that project specifically, so this was something that was tell our listeners maybe that aren't from St. Louis. Is it smack dab in the middle of downtown or next to a bunch of other old buildings, or what's the site
Yeah,
look
it's
like?
21C St. Louis is on Locust Street, just one block off from Washington Avenue. It's actually corner of 16th and Locust, and it's down in the old, call it Garment District, right next to the historic Campbell House, where there used to be all the row house mansion. So it is, when we were working on the project, I would walk, if I could get a lunch just long enough, I could walk comfortably to the arch and walk back and call that my steps for the day.
That kind of puts it in a perspective where it is. So in terms of, you're talking about just catching things early and identifying things almost like in a forensic type of way in maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago or more, when did an owner realize some of these things without VDC? You must catch so much more on the front end of things.
With the VDC application, it's not, let's say, new. It's just a retooling of how we used to do things. The goal is to preemptively identify those before they become a cost application or an impact on the job. The goal is to maintain the client's vision, the architect's design. But in that application for what we're utilizing, and like what you were saying previously, 20, 30 years ago, you would identify those things when you got to that point in construction. Hopefully, the design team was going out and getting as much information as possible about the existing structure. But depending on the application of demolition, if you had to mitigate or abate any areas, you're in a position where you're going to have unforeseen conditions behind a wall, within a floor deck, at a roof assembly. You're going to have drains that shouldn't be in that location based on a typical design that are going to be running through, and they're supposed to be remaining. It's those kinds of applications that we're able to go in and try to identify as much as possible at different stages in construction prior to, let's say, purchasing, or prior to actually engaging your carpenter on doing layout of the building.
It seems so critical from several ways, but especially I'm sure when owners are getting lending or investors to finance a project, it seems that would really come to bear on that as well. Because if it's a oops and they're committed and it's something super expensive, you wouldn't have known, like a 100-year-old sewer system running through it or something.
In terms of benefits too to the owner, VDC is just another way in which construction plans and designs become tangible. And tangibility is something that construction has always strived for. It started with drawings, then you move on to physical models with architecture firms, and VDC is just one more step with that. It makes the project tangible and viewable and observable, not just to the client, but to their investors or to their potential build teams.
On top of that, from an application, the client going in and utilizing this, they're putting themselves in a position to identify design concerns or design applications that, because of an unforeseen, specifically on 21C, let's talk about some of the structural applications. The undulation of the floor assembly caused a change in design from the engineering systems. Now, it's a 106-year-old building. Not everything's as straight and plumb and perfect as it was when it was constructed. And so you want to be able to take into account those considerations. But when you start integrating your mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems that are all trying to be not seen by the final product, you need to maintain that application and have that understanding and that existing component. So on 21C, utilization of laser scanning, coming back to the overall with client application, we're able to provide the client with that data and that information to say, hey, we have 2.5 inches of undulation between these floor systems. Our entire engineering system comes down, our window systems, our finished materials, everything into the curtains and the rods on the wall get modified with that trickle down of design.
Yeah.
And we're able to identify that at the beginning. We're able to say, hey, we have limitations set that are not going to be able to maintain what is shown in the design or what the intent is. And we want to maintain as much of that vision as possible with the parameters we have.
Makes a lot of sense. Gosh, just the ripple effect of design and engineering. And that was a perfect example, I think, of a little inconsistency in the floor and everything above it and below it is affected. So when an owner's kind of evaluating a potential adaptive reuse project, guys, what are some factors that Russell, your firm, considers to just help guide the owner with, hey, it's a beautiful building. I don't know if I would recommend you move forward, or yes, it's a green light. What would you say, Byron?
Things that we can provide are as essential as having a knowledge base on the historic. Construction is not what it used to be. There's different practices, there's different means and methods and materials. So the first thing you want is a team that has an almost intimate understanding of how these buildings were constructed. And Taylor just spoke to one, but for example, these days when we pour concrete floors or put joists or structures in, we make sure it all lines up nice and even. And very often the case, at least in St. Louis 100 years ago, close enough was good enough, right? It's a little challenging when you buy a building and you're expecting each floor to be the same and you want to have the same delivery on each floor, but the original construction either limits that or makes that infeasible. There's also a lot of things to consider that when you want to do the reuse part, where you want to renovate, reuse, or showcase these existing spaces, oftentimes which are really beautiful and worth preserving, you have to have people who understand how to work those materials, where they come from, and what the properties are. And I think that's the essential part we also provide is that in addition to 21C, our field leadership has done dozens of historic renovations or reuses across the St. Louis area over the past couple of decades. So they could spot a building from across the street and probably tell you when it was made and out of what. And I've had guys even down to the quarry come up and tell me where certain stones have come from just because they understand where the construction was at the time. And that knowledge is, I would say, almost invaluable.
To add on the other end of that almost is Russell is bringing that technology innovation, that integration of new tools, new applications to identify earlier, to preserve client expectations, to attain a schedule on a adaptive reuse, historic preservation, adaptive reuse application. It's really hard to define a schedule and be able to maintain it and meet it because a lot of times there are a lot of unforeseens. To Byron's point of having the right team, bringing in the right people, we optimize that by then putting technology in their hands. Russell optimization, we optimize collaboration between our design team, so the office and the field.
Yeah.
We're bringing those two together and giving them a space to collaborate, utilizing different tools such as a model viewer. So our field team has the ability to see a 3D model, it's called a digital twin sometimes, of what that final product is going to be, what it's going to look like in that space. So if I'm the plumber going in, I can see into the walls, I can identify, hey, I know we're going to have these issues. And all of those things play together. It gives that visualization and it gives that collaboration so that our subcontractors are able to communicate with us as a general contractor, but that also transcribes into us being able to communicate to our owner effectively. Sure. And so it identifies all of those pieces. And as we move back into that system, that's how we're maintaining that vision. So bringing in that client and saying, yes, this is feasible. This is what the capabilities are. We're optimizing that innovation of technology to create and visualize what the final outcome is going to be prior to having to stick a shovel in the ground.
VDC is in many ways not just a service, it is in fact a tool, and it's a tool that is applied both in office and in the field.
Sure. Going back to 21C, and let us know for those who, again, who aren't in St. Louis, is that project complete? When did that wrap up? Is it still in progress?
It is.
Smiling. It never ends.
No, it is. It's complete, and I'm smiling
Okay.
because I'm happy to have visited 21C as just a guest. I would go get drinks before the Cardinals game once or twice at 21C. They have a lot of action and a lot of fun down there. It is open. It's a boutique hotel museum with its own fitness center, gym setup that you can have a membership to if you're a resident. You can book a room or you can go see the art galleries. They're free and open to the public. In the area, you can have a membership to the pool and the gym and all that down there. So I would say if you're visiting the St. Louis area, or if you're from here and you're passing through that part of town, there's absolutely no harm in stopping by and viewing the building.
It's also got a great restaurant and bar.
Oh yeah, right. I did restaurant and bar, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. When you guys are doing the adaptive reuse, like you said, you're not taking 106, 108-year-old Y and making it a YMCA again, you're making a hotel and museum. Is it art, science, or both with all the modern amenities and things that adaptive reuse lets you incorporate? I don't even know where that question will resolve, but just how is that all determined so that there's this still historic feel, but that you've got what people want, that they want the pool and the bar and the other amenities?
So I think that it comes from two ways. One, rests with the design team to identify spaces and opportunities where the history of the building or its original components can be preserved. There are also state and federal entities with the historic registry that help determine what spaces stay or how and why. In the case of 21C, for example, if you enter the building, the entrance has all the original stone, original coffered plaster ceiling with these original plaster rosettes that we had to save and pull forward. There's several historic spaces inside that building that got saved, and that requires a different trade approach and design approach to modernize those.
Add on that with the technology side, a lot of that is coming from optimizing that old school approach with bringing in that innovation of new. How are we able to maintain, exactly like you said, those rosettes, the plastered ceilings, the coffers, the pool was a
Yes.
big one where we had to retile, and some of the design eliminated some columns and areas. So
Yeah.
preserving that space, bringing it back to. But a couple of examples on Russell's standpoint for an adaptive reuse are really going to come into effectively pushing the schedule and maintaining that overall. We are prefabricating plumbing walls outside of the space. We're not stick building that. We are going to have that produced in a warehouse and then bring it in. The application that Byron was talking about of all of your floors stacking becomes a concern because the actual structure does not align. The ribbed vault structure that was in that space doesn't align floor to floor. So your plumbing has slight adjustments. You're making different cuts in the floor. The utilization of technology on that from a laser scanning standpoint to be able to then utilize the design models and integrate all of that together to then optimize the prefabrication so that we are expediting our schedule for install, preserves the final product, maintains the client's vision, but also puts us in a position where we're completing that job.
I would think with the prefabrication component, I'm sure it's safer and more expedient and everything, but I would think there's that moment when you haul whatever it is in to the job site and you I know it's more than crossing your fingers, but the value of all those scan data points and other precision applications, that must be a pinnacle moment when those pieces to the puzzle arrive and get placed.
And I think even the other component of it is VDC is a great tool for determining how you can solve problems ahead of time, but then it also becomes an amazing tool for solving a problem that just occurred today. Let's say you bring one of those walls in and something's misaligned and I need to make a change. Using VDC, I can forecast out all the ripple effects of making the change and we can weigh our options and what happens next. It exists on both sides of any given issue that you can try to forecast it or you can react to something that's happened and plan accordingly so you're not just chasing your tail with an issue later on, which for my mind out in the field is almost one of the most important parts. I would say like the day-to-day use out in the field for sure is when we encounter a problem that requires that hands-on problem solving. VDC often becomes the benchmark. We can look at the room in its empty, beat down existing form, and I can say to the folks in the field, here's the 3D model of what it's supposed to look like. Here's where all the mechanical, all the electrical, plumbing, here's where the architectural finishes are. We have problem X, and we need to still land at design, Y. So how do we get there? VDC bridges that gap.
And one of the things that C really identified for us, we estimated that we saved the client, the general contractor, the subcontractor, the entire team, internal, external, about $1.3 million on that job by utilizing VDC. Now, that overall application is just that we were able to preemptively identify, we were able to have conflict resolution early in the stages, identify the trickle down, and be able to make very cost-effective solutions, suggestions to our design team to help them maintain that vision again. And it's one of those things where that number for a quantified value compared to what the service cost initially is almost about 10 times the difference. And that application right there is why, we're talking about VDC becoming almost a requirement to have those services on an adaptive reuse type of building, because there are cost applications where you're going to run into those unforeseens. You're going to have some situations where we don't want to go back to the client and ask for more money. We don't want to have to go back and say, hey, because of this thing that happened, unfortunately, it sits in your lap. And so the goal there is to be able to maintain that and move forward with everything as is the initial vision of the client.
Looking ahead, guys, what do you see in terms of VDC related trends in adaptive reuse construction? Are there certain types of buildings or uses that are becoming more popular for this approach, integrating VDC, or could it be a hospitality project? Could it be an industrial project? I know Russell's in certain sectors, but where do you see additional technological uses of VDC?
I think definitely what's going to become more and more common is that it's not just something that the VDC guy in the office has and he sends you a snapshot and you have an email exchange with them. It is going to continue to be something that the foremen, the superintendents, the carpenters, the pipe fitters, everybody in the field is going to be utilizing the same way they would utilize their paper prints as we have for decades. It's essential increasingly as we produce buildings that are more architecturally complex with more complex MEP systems and amenities that you be able to view these in 3D because at least it's my personal belief it's harder to be standing in an existing space and visualize what it's going to be rather than if I was just standing out in a field and I could make up a building in my mind, but it's really hard to look at a room. It's all concrete, it's falling apart, and it's -14 outside. So it's 0 degrees inside the room. It's really hard to see that as what will eventually be the grand ballroom, for example. It's going to be an increasingly important tool in field coordination and in creating, I think, subcontractor and constructor buy-in. You want people invested in
Right.
your project. The guys building it, you want them to be able to see what they're making and have just as much stake in it as the owner in some ways.
On the trends for adaptive reuse, it's interesting. You're seeing in the St. Louis market specifically, there's been a lot of adaptive reuse. They did a really good job at the foundry, the armory. I think 21C is a really cool one. But the actual application of what the adaptive reuse is has been all over the spectrum. It's finding, does it fit in the culture? How does it fit within the market? What is your overall application for attendance to the space or whether it's a hospitality, senior living? I do think that you're starting to see a lot of adaptive reuse for some multifamily hospitality application is definitely there. There's a lot of the specialty getting put in. So something like the armory, which was turned into everything from main open space, activity, recreational, concert hall. There's a lot of things there. It's a bar, restaurant, all that kind of stuff. To across the street, you have the Foundry that is a food hall with Putt Shack, which is an interesting one, or Sandbox for VR. Really cool applications. And then there's the hospitality with 21C, boutique museum out of a YMCA. There's a couple other projects ongoing in St. Louis that are doing adaptive reuse as well. You also have the historical preservation where you are preserving what it was. You're going to maintain that and revitalize it back to what it was.
It's something that St. Louis has unfortunately struggled with historically is preserving our history. Not too long ago, the name of the game was if it's old, tear it down, right?
Yeah.
Build something new or nothing at all. So we have, unfortunately, a very limited pool of historic buildings remaining, and the uses of those buildings are still wide. So I think it's going to continue to be the case that these architecturally important or historic buildings find new life going forward.
I think that's wonderful, and I'm grateful to learn more about how Russell's doing that and look forward to having you gentlemen back on when you're on your next unforeseen challenge. Maybe later today. No.
Exactly.
We've been talking on this episode with Taylor Moon, Senior VDC, Virtual Design and Construction Manager, and Byron Conley, Project Engineer with Russell. And gentlemen, it really has just been a pleasure, and you've made it very understandable and intriguing for those of us that just are tangentially connected to construction and design. Thanks so much for being with us today, and I hope you'll come back.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'd love to.
To it.